this is Sonia from An Enthusiastic Reader, and today I'm recommending memoirs for Nonfiction November. This is the audio version of my channel today, so get out your knitting, pet the dog, do the dishes, or go for a walk as you listen in. I'll provide all the relevant information concerning the books in the box. You know where to look, right? The Nonfiction November Reading Challenge was created 5 years ago by Olive at ABookOlive, and the sole purpose of the event is to promote the love of reading nonfiction in any form. If you don't generally read nonfiction, the goal is to read at least one book in November. If you read nonfiction a lot, the goal is to read more. My favorite form of nonfiction is memoir, so I thought I'd recommend some of my favorites. This year, Nonfiction November has 4 prompts: design, voice, sport, and true. For my recommendations, all of them fit into the voice designation, and I will leave it up to you to choose your own. I've divided up my suggestions into 3 categories: actors, writers, and friendship. So let's get started. All right, I have 5 recommendations for actors who have written memoirs, and the first one I have is Born Standing Up, A Comic's Life by Steve Martin. This is an account of his first 18 years in the show business, being a stand-up comedian. And he started out working at Disney as a magician, and that's where he was introduced to the world of stand-up comedy and learned about timing and how to tell physical jokes and just how to be comfortable in front of the public. Because Steve was a very, very shy person. You probably heard stories about him, and he doesn't really like engaging with the public. But when he puts on the stand-up persona, he changes. He taps into something that doesn't come out in normal times. I really love this memoir because, A, it's written very well. I listened to the audiobook, and he reads it so well, and it's really kind of delves into his psyche and into his very fraught relationship with his father, who seemed to reject him a bit and didn't like him very much. And all of the pain from that interaction, I think, got channeled into Steve's stand-up comedy. So this is a really good, I feel, very honest and deep-diving memoir into the life of someone who's shy but doesn't come across that way. The next book I want to suggest is Born with Teeth by Kate Mulgrew. Kate Mulgrew is an actress. She was working in soap operas when she was quite young, and so this memoir does a lot of things. It talks about her childhood and her eccentric parents and the problems that they had and how much she loved them and they loved her. And one of her siblings suffers a great tragedy, and that affected her, and then she becomes an actress. And so you get to learn all about her love affairs, all of the roles she had, and then she gets pregnant and she has to decide what to do with the baby. And that's another big part of the memoir. It's really interesting. She drops just the right amount of names that you may or may not recognize. And if you've been watching her through the years, through the Star Trek franchise, or I don't think she gets as far as Orange is the New Black, which I thought she was fantastic in. So this one is a real nice, dishy, and well-written memoir. The next one I have is similar to Kate Mulgrew, and this is In Pieces by Sally Field. This is another well-written, insightful, honest account of her family life, which was fraught with a lot of problems, and a distant mother and an over-affectionate stepfather. Lots of broken romances, the development of her acting career, what happens when she becomes very famous for being the flying nun, which is a role that she absolutely hated, and then just what happens when you age in Hollywood and it's harder to get roles, and then the children that she had. So there's a lot of meaty stuff in this very well-written memoir. Hunger Makes Me a Modern Girl by Carrie Brownstein is kind of a coming-of-age story of a girl who gets into the punk rock scene in the Pacific Northwest in the 1990s. Hunger Makes Me a Modern Girl by Carrie Brownstein is a really tender and thoughtful look at a girl who falls in love with punk rock music And she starts a band with some other women, and they become Slater Kinney. Then they become very famous, and so it's about fame and about coming out, about grappling with a parent who has an identity crisis and a mother who is anorexic. And so she's got a lot of family issues, and she figures out, I think a lot of people find strength in the adversity that comes from having family that's dysfunctional, and this is certainly an example of that. And she talks a lot about female friendships and female romantic relationships, which is really interesting. Check out Hunger Makes Me a Modern Girl by Carrie Brownstein. The fifth and final actor's memoir that I have for you is really fun. It's called I Blame Dennis Hopper and Other Stories from a Life Lived in and Out of the Movies by Ileana Douglas. She's a character actress. You've probably seen her in a lot of things. She has very big eyes, and she is the granddaughter of Melvyn Douglas, who was a very famous actor in the earlier part of the 20th century. He was a film actor. And so she grew up kind of in a Hollywood family, and she is a really interesting woman, in love with old Hollywood. And then she becomes the girlfriend of Martin Scorsese, and she's in movies with him. This is chock full of gossip and stories about film actors. So, and it talks all about different movies she worked on and how they affected her, and just the ups and downs of being a woman in Hollywood. It's really good, and she has got such a exuberant spirit all the way through, and just the nature of friendships, the nature of art, and the nature of romance all encompassed in this memoir. So that is my actors section of recommendations, and now we will go on to the writers section of recommendations. And the first book I want to talk about is I Am by Maggie O'Farrell. She's a novelist, writing about times in her life when death was near in one way or another. She suffered from severe childhood illness. She almost drowned once when she was a young adult. What else? There were brushes with violence and just all kinds of different scenarios where if something had turned just a quarter of a turn the wrong way, she wouldn't have made it. So each chapter kind of stands on its own, but then if you take the whole thing into account, it's just a very good memoir. I know a lot of people on BookTube read it last year when it came out. I think that's right, last year or the year before. Everything's blurring into each other now, but I would read this again. She's just a great writer, and I really felt something in each of the individual stories. Giving Up the Ghost by Hilary Mantel recounts the novelist's childhood, and she had a fraught relationship with a stepfather who didn't really seem to like her very much and let her know that often. Her mother had a very weird living situation where she was involved with this other man, but her husband, the father of Hilary and the other siblings, was still in the house, and he was severely depressed and seemed to be just take to his bed. So she talks a lot about her childhood, and then she gets married quite young, and she starts suffering from endometriosis, and it was kind of undiagnosed, and people did not take it seriously, and she was in severe, excruciating pain for years, and then put on steroids and gained a lot of weight and couldn't get rid of it. And in the meantime, you see the development of a writer and the writer's mind, and it made me like her all the more, even though I really liked just the books that I had read that she had written. But it really made me feel very tender towards Hilary Mantel, and yeah, she's just something else. Slipstream by Elizabeth Jane Howard. She was a very prolific novelist, British, in the mid-century, 20th century, and she, surprise, has a very fraught childhood, and she was sexually abused by her father. She had many failed marriages. She was the stepmother to Martin Amis, and then she developed as a novelist. So she had a really interesting life with lots of famous people that are name dropped. I wouldn't say this is the best memoir I've ever read, but I liked the persona of Elizabeth Jane Howard so much that I would listen to her talk about anything, even though I think maybe she left a lot of things out and some of her life was glossed over quite a bit. Still, I can recommend it if you like gossipy, especially about other writers. Kingsley, she was married to Kingsley Amis, and they had a terrible relationship, and then she was married to several other people, so it was a lot of ups and downs in the romance department. An exact replica of A Figure of My Imagination by Elizabeth McCracken is a very tender and graceful story about her having a stillbirth baby at 8 months into her pregnancy. And they were in Italy at the time, and they were renting a house, and then they had this tragedy. And it's all about, how you deal with very hard subjects and which parts of your friend or which members of your friend group support you and which members don't say anything, and how you talk about a tragedy like this. And Elizabeth is she's a really good writer, and I think she handled this very gracefully and very tenderly. So this is one where you'll probably need some tissues along the way. The final writer's memoir I have to recommend is The Mistress's Daughter by A.M. Holmes. She was adopted as a baby, and this is the story of how both of her biological parents figure out who she is and come back into her life, and it's not a happy story. This is one of those adoption stories that you don't want to happen, and there's a lot of her reckoning with who her biological parents are and how that formed her in her writing life and in her other relationships. So this is a really good one if you like adoption stories and if you don't mind something that's quite a bit darker than you might imagine. Now we're coming to the friendship memoir portion of the presentation here. So the first one is The Futilitarians, Our Year of Thinking, Drinking, Grieving, and Reading by Anne Gisleson. Anne Gisleson suffered quite a few traumas in a very short period of time. Both of her twin sisters died, and her father died, and then she lives in New Orleans, and Katrina traumatized the entire city. So this is a novel about how you deal with so much trauma, and one way that she dealt with it was with her husband to form a book club for their close friends, and once a month they would read a difficult book and then have different kinds of activities to talk about the book and to explore the themes in the book. This was I enjoyed this one a lot. It was called the Existential Crisis Reading Group, and they read Epicurus, Tolstoy, Cheever, and Clarice Lispector. And so every month she writes a chapter about what book they read and what they got out of reading that book. So if you like books about reading and about book clubs, this is a good one. The next one I have to recommend is Let's Take the Long Way Home, a memoir of friendship by Gail Caldwell. She is a novelist, and she writes about her deep friendship with the memoirist Carolyn Knapp. And both of them are kind of difficult women and have had difficult, broken relationships. And they form an unlikely friendship over rowing, and they go out and row together constantly. And they also have a deep love for dogs. So there's a lot of dogs in this story. And I would also say you need to bring a Kleenex box to this particular memoir. It's pretty wrenching. Okay, let's go to the next one. Dear Bunny, Dear Volodya, the Nabokov-Wilson letters from 1940 to 1971, edited by Simon Karlinski. And this is a collection of edited letters back and forth between Edmund Wilson and Vladimir Nabokov. They had a pretty good friendship going, and they had pretty good correspondence, and then ego got in the way and they started feuding. And I just remember reading this back in my Nabokov fangirl days, and it's a lot of fun to read these letters back and forth, and they I wouldn't say that it's a happy book at all, but it's, if you like vicious wit and mean insults traded back and forth between famous men, then you might like this one. Finally, the last book I have to recommend is Truman Capote, in which various friends, enemies, acquaintances, and detractors recall his turbulent career, edited by George Plimpton. This is an oral history from all the people in Truman Capote's life whom he loved and then he betrayed. And yet, this is yet another pretty catty, vicious at times recounting of Truman Capote through the voices of his frenemies. Another book about writers, another writer versus writer type scenario. So it captures a pretty interesting time in American letters in the mid-1900s. Not for everyone, but I thought it was a lot of fun, and I would recommend it. So that's what I have in terms of memoir to recommend to you for Nonfiction November. Please let me know in the comments if you've read any of these or any of these sound appealing to you. And thank you so much for listening, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.